You think you're too good for this dirt, princess? The words barely left Sergeant First Class Brock Sullivan's mouth before his fist connected with Private Sarah Jenkins's jaw, a sickening crack that echoed across the dusty grinder of Fort Galloway, silencing 30 other recruits instantly. It wasn't a training tap. It was a full-blown, knuckle-dusting cheap shot that sent a 120-pound woman sprawling into the Arizona red clay, blood immediately welling up from a split lip. Sullivan stood over her, chest heaving, that vein in his neck throbbing like a garden hose waiting for her to cry, to beg, to do what every other recruit did when the butcher decided it was their turn to break. But Sarah didn't cry. She just lay there for exactly 3 seconds, her eyes clear, almost calculating, while a tiny, undetectable sensor stitched into the lining of her standard issue belt started flashing a silent, terrified red alert to a command center 3 miles away. See? What Sullivan didn't know, what nobody on that scorching parade deck knew, was that he hadn't just punched a recruit. He'd just triggered an Omega Red priority signal, effectively ringing the doorbell of the Pentagon's most sensitive directorate. He thought he was teaching a lesson in humility, but he was about 7 minutes away from having his entire 20-year career dissected, burned, and buried by men who didn't wear uniforms because they didn't have to. To understand why Sullivan swung that hard, you have to understand the friction that had been building for 8 weeks. Fort Galloway is where the Army sends infantry when they want to see if they'll melt, and Sullivan was the magnifying glass. He was old Army, hard, bitter, convinced that the new generation was soft, fragile, and in desperate need of the kind of trauma that he believed built character. And then there was Private Jenkins. She was frustratingly invisible. You know the type. Never first in line, never last. Her uniform was always squared away but not flashy. She didn't brown nose and she didn't complain. She was a ghost. But Sullivan had an instinct for weakness, or so he thought, and Jenkins' quiet demeanor rubbed him raw because he couldn't find a crack in it. She hit 38 out of 40 on the rifle range. Expert, but just barely. She maxed her physical fitness test by exactly 1 point. It was almost robotic. It felt, to a guy like Sullivan who lived on raw aggression, like arrogance. He hated that he couldn't make her sweat. He hated that when he screamed 2 inches from her nose, her pulse didn't seem to jump. He told the other drill sergeants she was hiding something, that she was one of those privileged kids coasting through on daddy's dime. And he made it his personal mission to expose her before graduation day. That morning, the combat readiness drill was his golden ticket. It was supposed to be controlled aggression, learning how to take a hit and keep fighting, but Sullivan changed the rules. He wasn't pairing recruits with recruits. He was stepping onto the mats himself. He wanted to demonstrate proper technique, which was code for finding the recruits he didn't like and battering them legally. When he called Jenkins out, you could feel the air leave the parade deck. Private Miller, a farm kid from Nebraska who bunked next to Jenkins, later said she felt sick right then because she knew. Everybody knew. This wasn't training anymore. It was personal. Jenkins stepped onto the mat with that same infuriating calmness. Hands up, balanced stance, almost too balanced, like she'd been doing this since she could walk. Sullivan threw the first few jabs at half speed, testing her. She parried them. Not flinched, parried. Efficient, tight movements that wasted zero energy. That just made him angrier. It was like she was bored. "Come on, superstar," Sullivan had sneered, circling her, looking for an opening. "Mommy's not here to write a note to get you out of this one. Show me you belong in my army." He threw a legitimate right cross then, fast and heavy. Jenkins slipped it, just a subtle shift of her weight, letting his fist sail past her ear, and for a split second, just a fraction of a heartbeat, her muscle memory betrayed her. She almost countered. You could see her hip twist, ready to drive a devastating knee into his exposed ribs, a move that would have likely cracked bone and dropped him instantly. But she caught herself. She froze the movement, forcing herself to stumble backward instead, playing the role of the clumsy recruit. Sullivan saw the stumble, but he missed the practiced grace that preceded it. He just saw an opening. "Pathetic," he barked, and that's when he threw the cheap shot, the backhand that dropped her. While she lay in the dirt, the real action was happening 3 miles away in the Tactical Operations Center. Specialist Daniels was staring at his monitor, which had just turned a frightening shade of crimson. He'd never seen an Omega Red before. Most people hadn't. It was a rumor, a ghost code reserved for assets so critical to national security that their safety superseded normal military chain of command. "Sir?" Daniels's voice cracked as he flagged down Major Torres. "The watch commander." I think the board is broken, sir. It's showing an Omega Red active at Training Ground 4. Torres didn't even look at the screen. He just snatched the red phone that bypassed the base switchboard. Get the QRF spin up now. Not the MPs. I want the heavy team. And call General Vance's office. Tell them we have a broken glass incident. Back on the grinder, Sullivan was pacing around Jenkins, feeling high on his own power. Get up! He kicked dirt onto her boots. We don't lay down on the job, Jenkins. You want to play soldier, you pay the toll. Sarah wiped the blood from her lip, looking at the bright red smear on her glove. She sighed a small, almost sad sound. She knew what was coming. She'd tried so hard to keep her head down for 6 months, to just be Private Jenkins, the unremarkable recruit, while she audited the base's infiltration vulnerabilities from the inside. But Sullivan had just ruined a multi-million-dollar DIA operation because he had an ego the size of Texas. She stood up slowly, dusting off her knees. Sergeant, her voice was steady, devoid of the fear that should have been there. I highly suggest you terminate this exercise. It wasn't a plea. It was an order, thinly veiled as a suggestion. The tone was so completely wrong coming from an E1 private to an E7 sergeant that it actually made Sullivan pause for a second. It sounded like an officer. That pause didn't last long, replaced quickly by blind fury. Did you just give me an order, Private? Sullivan roared, stepping into her personal space, spit flying. I will smoke you until your legs fall off. Drop and give me... I said. Sarah interrupted him, her eyes suddenly hard, locking onto his with a terrifying intensity that finally, too late, sent a chill down his spine. Terminate the exercise. You have no idea what you've just done. Sullivan raised his hand again, ready to really hurt her this time, to beat that insubordination out of her. But before he could swing, a sound cut through the dry desert air, the distinct high-pitched whine of turbocharged engines pushed to their limit. It wasn't standard military police Humvees. It was 3 matte black Chevrolet Suburbans, tearing across the dirt field, ignoring the marked roads, kicking up a massive cloud of red dust. They screeched to a halt in a tight tactical formation around the combat mats, effectively boxing Sullivan and Jenkins in. Sullivan spun around, bewildered. What the hell is this? Get those vehicles off my grinder. The doors flew open before the wheels even stopped rolling. Men in plain clothes, tactical pants, polo shirts, heavy plate carriers with no insignia, poured out, carrying short-barreled rifles that were definitely not standard Army issue. They didn't look like MPs. They looked like they erased people for a living. And then, from the lead vehicle, a man in an Army service uniform stepped out. Not just any officer. It was Lieutenant General Caldwell, the base commander, a man Sullivan had only ever seen from about 1,000 yards away during parade reviews. And he looked furious. Sullivan snapped to attention, confused, terrified, his mind racing to figure out how a training injury had summoned a 3-star general in under 5 minutes. General, sir, we were just conducting... Shut your mouth, Sergeant. Caldwell didn't even yell. He just projected pure, undistilled authority. He walked right past Sullivan like he was a traffic cone and went straight to Private Jenkins, who was still dabbing blood from her split lip. What happened next broke the brain of every recruit watching. General Caldwell, the god of Fort Galloway, stopped in front of the dirty, bleeding private, and he saluted her. Major, Caldwell said, his voice tight with restrained anger, not at her, but at the situation. Are you secure? Sarah, or rather Major Elena Vance of the Defense Intelligence Agency, didn't return the salute immediately. She just looked at Sullivan, whose face had gone from angry red to a pale, sickly gray. I'm secure, General, she said, dropping the private act entirely, her posture shifting from submissive recruit to field-grade officer in a blink. But my cover is obviously blown. Operation Glasshouse is awash. The silence on that training field was heavier than lead. 30 recruits stood frozen, their brains trying to compute the impossible image of their base commander taking a report from the quiet girl who slept in bunk 4B. Sullivan looked like he was having a stroke. His mouth kept opening and closing, but no sound was coming out, his eyes darting between the general's stars and the private's bloody lip. Major Vance turned fully to Sullivan now. The blood on her chin didn't make her look weak anymore. It made her look dangerous. Sergeant First Class Sullivan, she said, and it wasn't a question this time. It was an indictment. For the past 8 weeks, I've cataloged 14 separate incidents of you operating outside established training doctrine protocols. Verbal abuse, unauthorized physical corrective measures, misappropriation of platoon supplies for personal use. I was willing to let the investigation run another week to see how deep the rot went in your unit. She touched her swollen lip gingerly. But you just had to rush the timeline. Major, Sullivan stammered, his entire world crumbling into dust right there on the mat. I didn't know. It was just training. I was trying to toughen you up. You were bullying a subordinate because you felt inadequate. Vance cut him off, her voice ice cold. If I had been a real private, 18 years old, fresh out of high school, what would you have done next? Broken my nose? Kicked me while I was down? You didn't just hit an officer today, Sullivan. You demonstrated exactly why I was sent here. To find the toxic leadership that's bleeding our readiness dry from the inside. General Caldwell gestured to the tactical team. 2 of the plainclothes operators stepped forward, zip ties already in hand. They didn't treat Sullivan with the professional courtesy usually afforded to a senior NCO. They spun him around and cinched his wrists tight, right there in front of the privates he'd terrorized for 2 months. Get him out of my sight, Caldwell ordered. And Sullivan? You better pray the JAG lawyers are in a good mood, because you're looking at assault on a superior commissioned officer, conduct unbecoming, and gross negligence compromising a Tier 1 national security operation. You won't just lose your stripes, son. You're going to Leavenworth. As they dragged Sullivan away, his boots leaving pathetic little furrows in the dirt he loved so much, Major Vance finally relaxed her stance. She looked around at the other recruits, her former peers. They weren't looking at her with awe. They were looking at her with betrayal. And that's the kicker, isn't it? The part of the story that doesn't sit right in your gut. Private Miller, the farm girl who had shared care packages with Vance, who had cried on her shoulder after the first week of hell, just stared at her. When Vance tried to approach her, Miller took a half step back. Was any of it real? Miller asked, her voice shaking, not from fear this time, but anger. When you helped me fix my rifle? When we talked about home? Or was I just another part of your investigation, ma'am? Vance stopped. That was the cost of the job, the part nobody talks about when they tell these hero stories. To catch the bad guys, sometimes you have to lie to the good guys. You have to use them. The help was real, Miller, Vance said softly. The job? The job requires lies. I'm sorry. Miller didn't answer, just turned away, falling back into formation as a drill sergeant from another platoon rushed over to take command of the chaotic scene. Major Vance didn't stay for graduation. She was extracted within the hour, vanished back into the shadowy world of intelligence where she belonged. The official story at Fort Galloway was that Private Jenkins had a medical discharge, a lie that everyone in that platoon knew, but nobody was allowed to talk about. Signed non-disclosure agreements ensuring their silence. Sullivan got 5 years in military prison and a dishonorable discharge. The base got a massive overhaul of its training cadre, weeding out 3 other instructors who favored fists over manuals. On paper, Operation Glasshouse was a massive success. It made the Army better, safer for the next batch of kids coming through. But sometimes I wonder about those recruits. They learned a hard lesson that day, one that wasn't in the training manual. That everyone has a secret. That things are rarely what they seem. And that sometimes the person you trust the most is just wearing a very convincing costume. It's a win for justice, sure. Sullivan got what he deserved. But it leaves a bitter taste, doesn't it? Knowing that to fix the system, you have to break a little bit of trust along the way. So, what's your take? Was Major Vance a hero for going undercover to expose a toxic leader? Or does spying on your own troops cross a line that shouldn't be crossed? Would you have forgiven her if you were in that platoon? Or would you feel used? Let me know down in the comments. I really want to hear what you think about the price of this kind of justice.